Alright, so in the last episode we were talking about just the basics of Pathfinder. Now in this episode we're going to start making your character. So the first thing we're going to have to consider is what race your character is going to be. So, one thing we need to think about first is that, okay, so humans are going to be the most common race. While they're the most common, it doesn't mean that the other races are unheard of. As a matter of fact, in most cities there's going to be at least one of the other races, usually. But in a typical human city or town, it's going to be mostly humans. Probably about, 80% humans. But you will have some other dwarves and elves and all the other ones. We just have to keep in mind that in the Pathfinder setting, humans are usually the most common. And that the distribution isn't entirely even. With that out of the way and my need for clarification done, let's go ahead and talk about each of the most common races. There are 7 of them. One of them is humans, and then there are 6 other ones that I'm going to discuss now. So we can start off with dwarves. Dwarves are particularly stern. They like to live underground or in mighty fortresses. They can be traditionalistic to the point of xenophobia, where they reject all other cultures and religions and societal standards, which is one of their major drawbacks. Next we have elves, who are very tall and thin, and they have extremely long lives, and their appearance tends to adapt to the sort of setting they're putting themselves in. So if they're in a forest for a long time, they're going to start taking on the colors of trees and leaves, and maybe develop greens and yellows on their skin to a very slight degree. They also have pointed ears, which they're infamous for. And since they live so long, as a matter of fact, they can live at least 5 times as long as humans can, living 500 years or more. This makes them particularly patient as a race, and it can also make them particularly sad when they're interacting with other races, because every other race dies before they do. After that, we have gnomes. Gnomes are the craziest race. You can make them any color you want them to be. You could basically pick any color of the rainbow and have that be assigned to a hair color and an eye color and a skin color, and you would get an accurate gnome. I made a gnome once who was very dark-skinned and had orange hair, for instance, while there are others who have bright yellow skin, gigantic eyes, and green hair. And you would think it would be dyed, and sometimes they do dye it, but it is entirely natural for them, and they like to put their hair in the craziest styles possible. And they're also particularly interested in exploring and tinkering and doing outrageous things, and they are prone to a condition called the bleaching, which means that if they don't keep themselves active and doing interesting things for a long time, they're prone to getting senile particularly young, which motivates them to be even more outrageous than they're prone to being already. So half-elves are half-elf, half-human, and their race is often built off of the idea that they are rejected by both societies, not particularly out of malice, because elves are pretty good-natured and humans can be good-natured sometimes. But they just don't have a home in either of these societies. Now, a half-elf can either be born from a human and an elf, or from two parents which are half-elves. This is two different ways you can handle it when you're making the backstory for your character. The other half-race we have are the half-orcs. Orcs themselves are very savage, brutal, and absolutely barbaric, and will kill anything they see if they feel like doing that. And some of these traits are passed on to half-orcs, although it could be said that half-orcs have the body of orcs and the minds of humans, which is particularly useful for orc tribes because they're not quite as intelligent as humans are, so they will often take these half-orcs and then put them in leadership roles, and this makes their strategies and tactics a lot more effective. However, it's also true in both societies that they are also rejects. They are also often the product of an orc raping a human, because orcs are so particularly savage that they will see it fit to rape humans if they want to do so. This contributes to half-orcs being rejected. So this is usually the case for why they're born, but there are some regions where half-orcs are a true breeding species on their own. So in such a case, they have more of an opportunity to have a half-orc tribe or society to be fit into and feel accepted in. And lastly, we have humans. Now, for all of these other races, we've been talking about general traits that these races have, but the unique thing about humans is that they are so unique. You can't really put them into a particular spot. Some humans may live in tribes, others may live in cities where fashion is very important and maintaining a social standing so that you can impress others. Humans come from so many different cultures that it is difficult to put them in a box, and they are the most varied of all of the races. Now, we've discussed 7 races so far. These are what are called the core races. In other books, there are other races. However, these are usually the most common throughout all settings. So, if you're going for a common character, or at least a reasonable character, you should be choosing from one of these. Now, since we're on the topic of races and species, now's a good time to bring up some terminology that they use. Basically, the 3 terms I'm going to discuss are creature versus humanoid versus monster. A creature is a general term. If you're basically living or playing a role in the story, you are a creature. Now, living, I use hesitantly because undead, which are dead things, are also considered creatures, and plant beings are also considered creatures. Creatures are the most broad general term, whereas humanoids are more like goblins, orcs, anything with pretty much a head and 2 arms and 2 legs that lives. That would be a humanoid. And pretty much everything else that doesn't have 2 heads, no, 1 head and 2 legs and 2 arms, that would be considered a monster, usually. There are, of course, a million exceptions to this, but you get the general point. What having a race is going to do for your character is it's going to give you a basis for your backstory, and it's going to give your character some abilities to start out with. So, since dwarves are more squatty and stout and short, their center of gravity is going to be lower, so they'll get an ability called stability, which makes them harder to trip and push over, because their center of gravity is so low that it makes it difficult for them to push over. Now, with these abilities, some of them are trained into their culture, while others are more physical and less changeable. So you'll see in some things, like with elves, they'll get certain training with particular weapons. Well, they're not born knowing how to use rapiers and bows. They know how to use those weapons because they were trained with them in their childhood by their culture. So you should be able to pick out the difference between the two of those. It should just make sense to you. Next we have halflings. Halflings are a short, small race. They like to wander quite a bit, and they're considered very lucky. Nobody's entirely sure why this is the case, but they simply are. They like to travel barefoot a lot of the time, and they have hair growing on their feet, and their feet are particularly calloused because they walk around so much not wearing shoes. They also have a tendency to shrink into society, sort of acting in the background more than anything. So like I've been saying, culture affects your characters quite a bit. It gives your character something to start out from. So even if your character is entirely throwing away the culture they were growing up in, like say for Regengar, he has no particular need to act dwarven and drink a lot of beer and act very traditional. He doesn't like to be stereotyped as a dwarf because he simply feels it's not true, and it gets on his nerves when every single person is misconceiving of his personality, and he just finds it a hindrance more than anything. But he is still affected by his rejection of his culture. You can never, I don't think, make a character that isn't affected by their race, but you can make a bad character that is totally affected by their race. So, an example of what I think is a bad idea for a character is to look at the descriptions of the race that your character is and make your character stuffed into a box of what that race is. So that would be like making a dwarf character and making them drink beer all the time and tugging on their beard and making their character wholly about being a dwarf, rather than it being a person who's influenced by their dwarven culture, impacting who they are. Your character shouldn't be their race, they should be impacted by being their race. That's not an absolute law, but it's my own opinion that that makes for slightly better characters. Next episode we'll be talking about classes. If you have any more questions or curiosities on race, leave it in the comments below, and I will try to answer it. Okay, I will see you in the next video.